opening opposition. Who do we have first? Do we have the opening opposition team? Do we have speakers from Leiden?
Sorry, we had a bad microphone.
Louis speaking first, EUDC.
Kat, second sheet, please.
Wonderful, thank you very much. In closing government?
Hello, hi, sorry, I was Kevin Hamill speaking first, no preference, thank you very much.
And then Jackson at speaking second, also no preference. Thanks very much.
Sorry, the sound was cutting out for me there for a second. Can you repeat the second speaker, please?
Sorry, Jack Sinnott speaking second. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And in closing opposition?
Hi, Rumen speaking first, Nikolai speaking second. We have no preferences.
Wonderful. I'll let the panel introduce themselves as well. So we're all good to go.
Hi, my name is Juanita. She or they is fine.
Hi, my name is Lucas. He, him, please.
Hi, I'm Senkai.
Hi, my name is Atol.
Okay. So if we're good to go, we'll just get the timer going. Same standing orders as previous rounds. A reminder, you are all already aware that this round is streamed. Just making sure judges and teams are aware. If we're ready to start, I'd like to call on the first speaker of the government.
Can everyone hear me? Yep, okay, perfect. Panel, two things from opening government. One, on why other strategies are unlikely to succeed, and then secondly, why this is likely to succeed, talking about public buy-in, government backlash, and why it's unlikely that these videos will come out as fake. Before that, some framing in our stance. What does this look like? I think in countries like Russia, it probably looks like embarrassing Putin, right? So similar to the kind of fake sex tapes that he has made of his opponents, it's likely to have the similar kind of response. So it often directly tackles the image of being a strongman that everyone of these dictators kind of wants. Secondly, in countries like Saudi Arabia or India, it could look like fake recordings that show them doing things that are considered wrong in Islam or in Hinduism, which is likely to cause outrage among the religious groups that often support them, right? So things like drinking alcohol, for example. Secondly, we think these groups are likely to only use this for advancing pro-democratic causes, like the motion says, and they're also likely to do this in a smart way, right? These groups want to ultimately advance their cause. It's unlikely that they're just going to go crazy and just do this whenever. They're going to, if they see that something is like facing a lot of backlash and it's unlikely to succeed, then they can withdraw that or like take their strategy back a bit. I think they can be adaptive in how they do this. On our stance then, one, we think it's a proportional and fair response. Some context here. Often these kind of opposition leaders face similar kind of fakes in the first place, right? So for example, in Russia, where there's a massive spread of sex tapes of these opponents, I think it's therefore a proportional response to what they're facing from their government and the status quo. This kind of response to evil, one, because it's kind of proportional to what they're already facing, and two, because it's a response to evil anyway, we think is principally legitimate. We think it makes it fair, even if it is not successful. Opposition has to prove why in these cases there's an active harm. But secondly, and most importantly, we think it gives you the ability to achieve good outcomes for people. Why? One, they're currently living in a dictatorial regime without any social reforms. We think at the point at which we give them at least some change for the future or some potential for change, that's a good thing. Secondly, often like their economic capacity is very limited, right? Low FDI, the dictator cares very little about them. We think this makes them care more in terms of helping the people in order to get back that support. Thirdly, we think democracy will just lead to more political freedoms. Like this is super intuitive. So why are other strategies unlikely to succeed? We think the kind of strategies that opposition has to defend in this debate are things like protests or public disagreements with policy. The reason why these don't succeed in the status quo is a fewfold. Firstly, they just don't get the same kind of platform and attention, right? So often these kind of protests actively don't get the same kind of attention in Russia. Even if you contest an election, as Alexis Tsipras, you're just unlikely to get the same kind of response. But secondly, you just people aren't responding to the kind of things they're saying right now. One, because you often lack evidence, right? Especially if you have situations like for a neutral majority, like in Nazi Germany. Secondly, with people like Putin, you often have a cult of personality. So this idea of infallibility, you don't see them as human, you see them as godlike. You often fear them, thirdly, and this could be the tipping point in increasing your anger. Fourthly, the government is doing like the same thing to political opponents, therefore you don't see them as kind of good people. So why are they likely to succeed on our side of the house? Firstly, why will this not come out or is unlikely to come out as fake? We think the technology for deepfakes is just very, very good, right? It's improving steadily. So we think even, especially in the future, it's unlikely that it comes out as fake. But secondly, even if they are fine now, we think one, it's really, really hard to challenge because often you'd have to prove some kind of counter evidence or some sort of evidence that this is actively fake. We think that's hard to do. Secondly, the spread of the response is likely to be less, right? So you're comparing a viral video of Putin like saying something ridiculous about his people versus a government response that's unlikely to get the same kind of attention. Secondly, then, why is backlash from the government likely to be minimal? And this is crucial because it takes out a lot of what opposition can say in this debate. Two mechanisms here. Firstly, it makes them look guilty. So it looks like if you're cracking down, if people are already suspicious, like we've established, it's likely that that feeds into that narrative, right? It makes the government look guilty. So for example, if you're already suspicious that the BJP is anti-Muslim, you now see a tape of someone in the BJP saying this, it's likely that this crackdown makes them look guilty. But secondly, they're often already weak, right? If you're looking at Russia right now, with massive protests in Eastern Russia because of the removal of a democratically elected governor, is likely to feed into that narrative. The government is unlikely to be able to challenge that. Secondly, then, on why you get public buy-in, and I think this is really important. Firstly, they finally see the strongman or this dictator as a fallible human being and no longer perfect, right? It's similar to the kind of perception that you often get when these kind of strongmen lose a war. Internal perception-wise, it means that they often get more challenge from the opposition. Secondly, externally, they often are like more subject to invasions afterwards. We think it's a similar kind of mechanism in making them look like they're not godlike. Secondly, people respond to audio and video recordings because they seem to be real and undeniable, right? It's likely to increase their anger towards a regime that they already have. Three, people are already skeptical of these regimes, right? Dictators are able to do things in the status quo with good PR. We actively undermine their ability to use things like propaganda against the opposition. And lastly, sometimes even if you know that something is going on, it's really, really hard to find evidence of that, right? So for example, the current Indian government acting against Sikh minorities within their country, at the point at which you have evidence, even if it's fake, it's likely that you get public buy-in. So what does success then look like on our side of the house? Before I move on, if there's a POI from closing, I'll take one. Opening, anything? Cool, okay, what does succeeding look like? One, we think it looks like voting in more liberal parties, right? So in India, for example, voting for the Congress instead of the BJP party. We think this is most effective in probably the kind of semi-democratic regimes. We think that this is where most of this debate takes place, right? So countries like India, Tunisia, Hungary, Poland, Turkey. But even in the extremely kind of oppressive regimes, we think we do get small changes. So for example, increased protests and civil disobedience, increased international attention, like look, a kind of sex tape of Putin, for example, is going to attract massive international attention. Secondly, we think it increases the likelihood of regime change in the future. So for example, in apartheid South Africa, like when they actively then pass laws to abolish apartheid. What's the weighing in this debate, and why is this the most important material that you'll get from any team in the round? Firstly, we think people being able to retaliate in a proportional way that they face is the most important thing, right? Even if opposition can prove that it's unlikely to be successful, we think they have the right to respond to the sex tape that are made of them in the status quo in a way that's proportional. Any kind of resistance to evil is a principle that we should support in this debate. But secondly, we think it's just likely to lead to success and more likely to lead to success than other potential solutions are. We think for those reasons specifically, even if the change or the potential for change is small, the kind of change that you're likely to succeed or to get on our side of the house is huge. It's likely to improve people's lives. It's more likely that they get democracy. For all of those reasons, vote OG.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. If the rest of the panel is ready to go. Yeah. Cool. I'd like to invite the leader of the opposition.
Can everybody hear me? Most of my material will clash with the Prime Minister. However, I want to talk about the framing of this debate. The Prime Minister said that we can never have anything or never have any benefits for democracy because protest doesn't work, and sort of saying that the government is bad doesn't work. I fundamentally disagree with that. The thing that these pro-democratic movements do now is they educate people. They do organize protests, and that has an effect. Maybe it doesn't mean that Russia will become a democratic country. However, the protest in Russia did mean that Putin had to focus on the nation. He couldn't just do his international game of bombing the shit out of Ukraine or bombing the shit out of Syria. He had to focus on the national, on Russia itself. For example, lower the like this happened when he lowered the age for retirement, and that was incredibly important for the world, but also for Russia. This can happen on a local level, where on a local level, people's decisions, leaders' decisions, will be called out, and makes it harder for them to be extremely cracking down on people. Makes it harder for authoritarian governments to be the worst as they can be. We do think that these pro-democratic groups do have a point now, and that's why people join them. That's why people do protest. That's why people do try to do things. However, even if we cannot have a benefit there, it can get worse. Look at the Arab Spring. Look at Ukraine. Sometimes it's better to not have these groups being worse, what they will be if they start using deepfakes. Also, just not as sometimes stability is better in this sense, and therefore we would like to oppose. Firstly, why are these groups going to be called out by the government and then going to be ridiculized and lose all support? Firstly, these groups are fundamentally bad at faking, worse than faking for the government. Firstly, that's because they have very limited funds. Usually these groups are quite small. Usually these groups don't necessarily have sort of the support of the general population. That means that they don't necessarily have enough money. They also don't have enough talent to, for example, use deepfakes. I have no idea how to make a deepfake. I'm unsure how these democratic groups in Russia will be able to do it. I also just fundamentally disagree that the technology is already as good so that nobody can call it out. I will respond to that later. Also note that the West can, for example, not always help. Firstly, because they might be otherwise against this group, because this group might, for example, also be religious and the West doesn't want to be affiliated with them, or the groups don't want the West's help because they know they'll lose the support. So they don't necessarily will be good at faking, but they will definitely try. They will not always do it smartly because they see a cause, they see other democratic movements trying to do that, and they will simply copy that. So it's unclear whether there will always be great deepfakes, whether there will always be great convincing articles of fake news, which is simply contested, and there is no explanation why that will be good. But even if it's not necessarily as good, we know that the government, which they are currently fighting against, have control over all the rest of the media. So they are able to, if they see one deepfake, if they see one fake news article, they are able to call that out, and because they control the media, they can call that out throughout the entire country. They can simply send that message to literally everyone within that country. So it makes that the governments have much more tools to fight these groups on the level of deepfakes. That makes it incredibly hard to do that. Governments will simply ridiculize. If one group does this, governments will say all these democratic groups are using deepfakes. They are telling you the lies. They are trying to topple the government. But they're doing that with lies. And that will definitely not look for these groups, especially because this is against the nature of these groups. Pro-democracy means open info, open discussion, informed voters. It means not sitting on the extremes, but trying to be a little bit more moderate. All of those things you throw out of the window when you are starting to use deepfakes. Governments will notice this. Governments will see fake news articles. Governments will deny that there were deepfakes, and most people will believe them. And that means that they can never buy into these pro-democratic groups. opposition will obviously say, yeah, but that's always the case. The problem is if you're actively telling them lies and the government can actually show this, that's obviously much worse. There's like a spectrum here where people are sometimes willing to buy into pro-democratic like groups, but they're not willing to do this after this. The second point that I want to make is that pro-democratic groups will get worse or not necessarily good on opposition side of the house. Firstly, sometimes these are just Western lobby groups who wants to liberalize the economy and not necessarily want to make the government function. Sometimes these groups are captured by groups that are not in power but are authoritarian or otherwise shitty. For example, extremely religious or neo-Nazis, as you saw in Ukraine. Those kind of problems, like that firstly makes the moral claim that governments tries to make extremely marginal, because these groups are not necessarily good. They might be like terrible groups who just want to topple the government. But secondly, the discussion within that group becomes harder because you're constantly telling lies. You are willing to do everything for the cause that you are fighting. That you were fighting for, right? So those kind of things makes these groups incredibly worse because they're not able to have that discussion, which makes democracy effective. So you don't get the benefits of these groups. They will become worse and they're not necessarily good to begin with. What you see, Ukraine or the Arab Spring, where the comparative would be a slowly transition to power, where these groups can like fight certain decisions and therefore have some minor impacts. Maybe that is small, but it's definitely better in opposition where you have no benefits. OG.
How does the government actually prove this? Like, how do you prove that your leader has, if you're a Muslim leader, has never drunken alcohol? Like, are you going to publish 24/7 surveillance of that person?
No. I mean, how do you prove? You're just simply going to like show that that it's fake news. You're going to show that this deep fake, that there's weird parts of it, and therefore it cannot be a real video. You're going to look at the code and say, look, here you can see that it has been faked. All of those things a government can do, and since they already have control of the media, since they already have all of the avenues to inform their people and to like propaganda to make people believe that's going to be extremely hard for the pro-democracy groups to fight. The last point is that pro-democratic activists cannot limit the use of fake news or deep fakes if they use this. Firstly, because this is based on skepticism, you actively have to look for fake news articles. You actively have to look at whether that video was weird. You're not going to do this if you already use it. Secondly, deep fakes now are really hard to make. They sometimes look a little bit odd, especially if these governments do not have the best tech to make it. Governments are less likely to take the risk then to make deep fakes or to spread deep fake news, which we already think is a benefit in itself. Vote OO.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. If the judges are ready to go, I'd like to call on the Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone hear me and see me? Amazing, thank you so much. Just 1 second. Panel, not all non-democracies are the same. The kind of extreme responses and the kind of extreme crackdown that they're talking about when they talk about these fake videos being like cracked down upon literally probably only apply to the most extreme cases of non-democracies. There is a range, and Louisa specifically told you that there was a range. They're semi-democratic regimes, they're weak democracies, and then they're hard dictatorships. And I think all of these are likely to have very different responses to it. And I'll give you a nuanced analysis of what this looks like in all three cases. But note here, two things first. They never responded to our principle about why it's unfair, or we shouldn't allow for these people to respond in a proportional way to the fact that they've been literally targeted like this in the exact same way by a government, literally publishing sex tapes of them that are extremely defamatory. They never responded to that. And the second thing Louisa told you is that resistance to evil in a way that might advance your cause is always going to be a good thing on principle. So even if we had no practical impact, that principle would still stand. What do they tell us on their side of the house? And again, I will give you the nuanced analysis of the three kinds of regimes later. Firstly, they tell us that that the other kinds of mechanisms for protest already work. So they talk about literally two mechanisms, which is education and protests. Why is there a couple of reasons why this doesn't work? The first reason is that you can educate people all you want, but if they're in line with the regime and they believe in it, you don't have the evidence to support your claim. So for instance, it is widely known amongst very liberal groups in India that the Modi government is actually ethnically cleansing Muslims. They are literally going into areas and cracking down on them very brutally. But the average Indian who votes for the BJP on economic grounds, who probably is somewhat sympathetic to Muslims in that country, doesn't know this, or at least won't believe it, right? At that point, having a fake news footage of like a BJP leader saying, I want to eliminate Muslims from the face of India is a massive tool that these organizations can use to shift that vote of a literally swing voter that now doesn't vote for the BJP. This is already true in a case where the BJP, for instance, is already losing seats every single year. And this is true for the vast majority of non-democracies, right? They're actively losing in a lot of cases. People are already skeptical and fed up of them. This could be the tipping point. We should principally support that. Secondly, there's a huge power imbalance when it comes to protests, right? It's often very difficult for you to go out on the streets and protest as one person if you don't know what the turnout is going to be, right? The more people go out, the far less likely it is that you as an individual is going to get hurt in that protest. We think at the point where you can sit behind a screen and publish a viral video that everybody is forwarding on WhatsApp, because note, India isn't able to crack down on an encrypted software. The vast majority of non-democracies in the world can't crack down on an encrypted software. You're much more likely to have the kind of buy-in to even have protests in the first place, right? If you know that people are quite angry because you've seen the kinds of forwards that are going around, because you see them not like the government in this instance, you as an individual are more likely to go out and protest in the first place. So if they think protests work, we access protests much better. Thirdly, on media capture, and this is literally their mechanism. So they say the government has control of the media. Yes, exactly. That means that they can literally spin protests in the way that they want. We have a tool right now to literally push these kinds of campaigns on social media through shares and WhatsApp forwards. This is the tool that we should actively use, panel, because we're able to mitigate for the power that the government has control over traditional media by using non-conforming media, like small things that people all have access to. We should be able to use that tool. So if they're going to tell you why protests happen on their side of the house, they need to prove why people have buy-in to go into those protests in the first place. At the point we tell you, we get that buy-in better. The second thing they tell us is that these videos are likely to be bad. 3 responses to this. The first response is that presumably in the vast majority of cases, the kinds of groups that are resisting are fairly educated liberal groups. So in India, this looks like the Congress Party supporter group, which is usually an educated elite. In like Russia, for instance, it also looks like people who are more educated than the average person. In Donald Trump's non-democratic America, it looks like more liberal people. You literally need 2 hackers to do this, right? Like you need 2 people educated in IT. I just don't know why this is so huge. But secondly, literally international hacker groups volunteer their services all the time. Groups like Anonymous will literally work with local democratic fighting groups to publish videos for them. We don't think the quality is likely to be that bad. But thirdly, say it's a little bit bad. I think in a lot of cases, this could probably add to the authenticity of the video. If it's blurry, for instance, it might show the fact that this is like a hidden recording that they didn't want the person to see. So I'm just not sure why this is the most important thing in this debate. And at least if we can prove to you in the vast majority of cases, this is going to be believable recordings. The last thing they say is the government's going to call them out. 3 responses here. The first is that if we're going to target things that actively hurt people's sentiments, so for instance, if you publish a Muslim leader drinking alcohol or a Hindu leader doing something that's against Hinduism, we think that image is very difficult for you to remove from your mind, even if the government says I didn't do this, because it's really hurt you as a voter for this party. So we think in those instances, even if the government tells you we didn't do it, that image is very difficult to separate from them. Secondly, it makes them look guilty. We've already told you this because people are already quite skeptical. We think that they're doing something bad, like for instance, in Nazi Germany, when there was suspicion that they were like putting Jewish people in concentration camps, but evidence of that, even if it's fake, because it's so hard to access, is something that can tip the vote. That's really important. But third, at worst, it's a competing narrative where on their side, there's only one narrative, right? On their side of the house, only the government is actively able to skew the perception of these opposition groups. On our side of the house, there are now 2 narratives where they're both skewing each other. At very best, we're winning on the margins here. This is really something you should consider as well. The final thing you tell us is on bad groups. Firstly, it's literally in the motions. These are pro-democracy groups. I'm not sure why they're Nazis or neo-Nazis at all. But secondly, at worst, if we're able to get some regime change, I'm not sure why the alternative to the current government is going to be so much worse than them. You need to prove that. That point has literally no impact. Before I move on, I'll take closing. Opening?
Is it principally justified to use fake footage of people?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's especially justified when we tell you that the vast majority of people in this country are oppressed. They don't have political freedoms. And I'm going to do the analysis now, and you'll see why small changes can make such huge differences. Where do we think we're most likely to succeed? The first kind of regime is the semi-democratic regime. This is all the analysis that Louisa gives you, and I repeat, about tipping the vote. We think this is going to be very, very high success rates. Secondly, on weak democracies, they already tell us that people are going out to protest, so these democracies are presumably already unstable. We agree with you, the government can't crack down forever, so they're already trying to come to the negotiating table. We think this is going to be the point at which we increase protests, first of all, because we demystify the fact that Putin is not like a godlike person. He is capable of making mistakes and doing dumb shit. And I think this is something that we should support. But secondly, we think that you're more likely to bring them on the negotiating table when you're actively disreputing them, right? Like if, for instance, at the point at which they're saying, please stop doing these things, we will come to the negotiating table because it's so defamatory for them. It's literally hurting their reputation, and it's unlikely that they're going to be elected again. We think that they come to the negotiating table then. But thirdly, on hard dictatorships, we think you get small changes. When Louisa gives you all the mechanisms for why you get more attention on these regimes, we think the kinds of responses you get, are, even though they're going to be slow, are going to be significant. So for instance, when apartheid freedom fighters did this during apartheid, the international attention meant that before they abolished apartheid, they had huge small changes to begin with. So they had the abolishing of pass laws before they abolished apartheid, because at the end of the day, you want to meet them where they're at, so they stop doing things that are actively damaging to you. For all those reasons, vote OG.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. The panel is ready to go. We'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Can you hear me? Thank you. 3, 2, 1. What proposition has to prove in this debate is not just that sometimes people will believe this information, but also that they will constructively translate this into effective pro-democratic action that actually effectively lands them with a government that is preferable to the one they had before. I think Louis has already proven to you, in Leader of Opposition, that given the fact that these groups are likely to get worse at the point where they use this, but also that it limits their ability to deliver the things that make democracy good, because democracy is not in itself an end goal. It is a very useful tool for allowing people to meet their preferences. At the point where this makes these groups worse at doing so, because they become used to misinformation and they use misinformation in order to empower themselves, it cannot deliver that. One response to their principle, then a decent amount of just fashing against their practical claims. They have an idea of a right to resistance and retaliation to evil that I think is quite interesting. However, it's complete nonsense. One, because you're not harming necessarily just the person that harmed you. You're harming a massive amount of third parties by lying to them and making it impossible for them to actually meaningfully engage with their own politics and reflect their own preferences. I think, given the fact that one, you're doing this for an unproven good, but secondly, you're harming them more than you are harming the person in government, because the person in government can defend themselves. The people who do not have a media apparatus against which to check your information, who do not have the tools to actually evaluate this, are significantly more harmed by being lied to than the person that you're retaliating to. But I think secondly, even to the no, they never actually prove why you are allowed to harm anyone except the person who hurt you in order to retaliate. Maybe they claim they prove it, but no, they give absolutely no analysis to that effect, at which point I think you should ignore it. But secondly, I think maybe personally you're allowed to retaliate in a disproportionate manner. I think in your role as activist, you take on a responsibility to be reflective of the principles of the activism that you do. You take on a responsibility to not try and deceive people. You're a pro-democratic activist because you're in favor of empowering them to do things. At the point where you want to be personally dogfighting people, maybe get the fuck out of politics and do it as a private individual. Okay, let's talk about practicals. Because I think they say, look, this is going to be done in a smart way and only for pro-democratic causes exclusively. I think for much of the rest of my analysis, I'm just going to take them at their best and assume that this is true. But note, they literally give no analysis for it. They say this is framing and never prove it. I'm going to give you two mechanisms for why it's nonsense. One, you have a situation where you have individualized like movements and groups that often, because they are in a relatively authoritarian regime, cannot effectively organize with each other, cannot coordinate information, cannot organize campaigns together, which means they cannot collaborate. They have very limited information because they often don't necessarily know what would be most effective. Because like please, opening government, tell me what information would be really good to say about Orban right now that would topple his regime. You don't fucking know this, and like neither do necessarily these movements, because it's really fucking hard to predict this. But also note that you feel powerless, you feel anger, and you just want to hurt them. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're engaging in effective strategizing. Secondly, I think pro-democratic movements are diverse in their reasons for wanting democracy. Sometimes they just want it instrumentally in order to then undermine democratic institutions in order to establish a different kind of regime. That can still mean they fight for democracy because they perceive it as the most effective tool for getting there. That makes them a pro-democracy activist. That can still make them the kind of neoliberal capitalist exploitation that Louis talks about. That can still make them religious extremists who just are not currently in power. That can still make them people who are just hoping to extract from that country for their own personal gain and think this is easier done. Let's then talk, like, let's ignore all this and let's pretend that opening government proved things and talk about efficacy. Because one, they say that these will be believed because it's something that you can just very easily do. Note that, like, I probably believe you can make a video. I don't necessarily believe that you can make a video that no one can like put a red circle into and put a funny music track behind and make it look fucking stupid, right? Because you can show, oh, the lip movements don't sync up perfectly with the words. Haha, that's so funny. And I think that's really hard to avoid. Like I did an internship that mostly like observed anonymous created content. Like note that it's not that good. Like the quality's pretty shite. Like it's just objectively untrue. But secondly, I think because like even if the videos were that good, because they have to operate contrary to prior framing by the government in terms of its indoctrination of what their leadership is like, in terms of like portraying the rebel, like portraying the pro-democracy movements as probably being traitors to their country, as being people who are looking to lie to you. I think it's incredibly unlikely that they're going to be effective because they have to go against a prior anchor in your mind of what the world is like. They would have to convince you that you were wrong. Most people stick to their opinions. Most people believe things are true. Suki says, oh, no, people are already super skeptical of these governments. Like one, at that point, presumably you can just latch onto their skepticism and just tell them about the actual truly bad things that they're doing. Secondly, I think like this is just oftentimes not necessarily true. Like you may not be perfectly satisfied, but that doesn't mean that subconsciously you don't still believe all the other things that you were previously told about the world they have done. Before moving on, CG, quickly go.
Do you think the people in these countries have to support the pro-democracy groups to recognize that things are bad in their lives?
No, I don't. Cool. Moving on to what I think is like happening in terms of no effective backlash. Like note that no attention is like a bullshit mechanism from PM speech. Like clearly there will be attention paid to state media that can make like funny, catchy call outs of people lying to you. I think that's something that people find pretty entertaining. It's a bit scandalous. It's nifty. People look at it. But secondly, I think like at the point where you have a situation where this like would potentially destroy strongman image, I just don't think this is true. Note that leaders like Trump or leaders like Hatze Strache in Austria have had like very embarrassing shit happen to them. But note that it doesn't really mean people don't buy into it anymore, because maybe you technically know that those things are true, but you still ultimately believe the first thing that made you like this person because you're invested in your past choice to like them. Then let's talk about like quickly about two more points of framing. One, we have the idea that this only happens in extreme cases. Like, I think that you can respond if you're the Hungarian or the Polish government. I don't think they're very extreme. Secondly, there's defamation laws and courts where you can sue people for lying about you and publishing fake video, even like in actual democracies. And thirdly, I think like you can just massively make this look stupid because these countries are already making protests look stupid. I think you can educate much more on recognizing deepfakes because there's a crucial delta. One, it's very hard for a government to make the moral claim that you shouldn't be able to tell when something is fake. That is incredibly difficult. Compare this to a government making the moral claim that you shouldn't believe something that is fake. Look at how funny this fake video is. It is massively harder for the government to counter your education on this. Secondly, it is not a direct attack on everyone who previously thought this person was a good person. If I bought into a politician being a good leader and I am now currently being made to feel stupid for that, I won't believe that. If I'm being given tools to figure it out for myself, I feel smart, I'm much more likely to buy into it. That is a better service to the people who need effective information and democracy than fucking lying to them, making them buy into democracy on false pretenses. I am so happy to oppose.